This resource video will provide you with an overview of the Title I Part A Schoolwide Program Campus Comprehensive Needs Assessment requirement being monitored as part of the 2022-2023 random validation process conducted by the Federal Program Compliance Division. Each LEA selected to participate in the random validation process for Title I Part A was provided with the name of one school-wide campus program. The LEA will be responsible for submitting the documentation requested for only that one school-wide program campus. Documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. To ensure the overall compliance with program requirements, LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. The documentation requested for submission during the random validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. The Title I Part A school-wide program is based on a comprehensive needs assessment of the entire school that takes into account information on the academic achievement of children in relation to the challenging state academic standards, particularly the needs of those children who are failing or are at most at risk of failing to meet the challenging state academic standards and any other factors as determined by the local education agency. Item 1.1 for the Comprehensive Needs Assessment Random Validation requires a description of the campus's Comprehensive Needs Assessment process. Acceptable documentation of this can include relevant pages of the Comprehensive Needs Assessment itself or the campus's improvement plan that includes the description of the campus's Comprehensive Needs Assessment process for the current school year. There are 4 points that should be addressed in the Comprehensive Needs Assessment description: the dates on which the CNA occurred, the stakeholders who were involved, the areas that were examined as part of the Comprehensive Needs Assessment, and the data sources that were analyzed. If the campus is a new campus, the dates on the CNA should reflect the dates that the CNA was developed. If the campus is an existing campus, the dates of the CNA should be the dates on which the CNA was reviewed and revised for the 2022-2023 school year. The description of the CNA should also include a list of the stakeholders that were involved, including the individuals by name and the role they fill on the committee. Parents may not be LEA employees in order to fulfill the parent role on the committee. The description of the CNA process should also include the areas examined. These could include curriculum instruction, demographics, technology, parent, family, and community engagement, and school culture, among others. The CNA description should also include a list of the multiple data sources that were analyzed as part of the CNA process. For example, these data sources might include academic achievement, prior year program evaluations, student attendance, student discipline, college and career readiness, and others. For CNA item 1.1, there are several items that could result in an LEA receiving an improvement needed status. These include auditable documentation requested was not submitted. The CNA summary did not have all of the required components. Or documentation from a prior school year was submitted instead of current school year documentation. For purposes of this validation, we will be looking at the meeting documentation that is required for one meeting. It is highly unlikely that a CNA process would take place in one meeting, considering that the process should be comprehensive in nature. The LEA should maintain documentation from multiple meetings in order to establish compliance. However, documentation from only one meeting is requested for this validation. The documentation submitted should provide evidence that the CNA process described in item 1.1 was followed. The standard documentation for a meeting includes a meeting agenda, meeting notes or minutes, and sign-in sheets or participant rosters that indicate attendance. These are the items that we will be examining as 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4. The meeting agenda should align with the description of the campus's CNA process that's referenced in item 1.1. The meeting agenda should provide evidence that the CNA process described in 1.1 was followed. The meeting notes or meeting minutes that are submitted should align with the description of the campus's CNA process referenced in item 1.1. The meeting notes or minutes should provide evidence that the CNA process described in that item was followed. The participant roster or sign-in sheet that's selected as part of this documentation should align with the description of the campus's CNA process that's referenced in item 1.1. The participant roster or sign-in sheet indicating attendance should provide evidence that the CNA process described in 1.1 was followed. Documentation for virtual meetings is acceptable. Given the increased use of virtual meeting environments, participant rosters that include the meeting title, meeting date, and the stakeholder names and roles for participants would be acceptable substitutes for the more traditional sign-in sheets. This eliminates the need of a participant signature for virtual meetings. This chart shows which details are required for different types of meeting documentation and which are considered best practice. For example, the agenda is required to have the meeting title, the campus name, the date, and the time of the meeting. It's a best practice to include the location. Meeting notes or minutes should include the meeting title, the campus name, and the date and the time of the meeting. It's a best practice to include the location of the meeting and the names and roles of the stakeholders involved. The participant roster should include the meeting title, the campus name, the date and time of the meeting, and the stakeholder names and roles. It's a best practice to include the location. Parents may not be LEA employees in order to fulfill the parent roles on the committee. For the CNA meeting documentation, issues that may result in an improvement needed status for the LEA include auditable documentation requested was not submitted, Documentation submitted does not reference the CNA process. Documentation submitted does not align to the CNA Item 1.1 documentation. Or documentation from a prior year was submitted instead of current year documentation. Please note that it is customary for an LEA to have begun and completed their CNA process in the months preceding the 2022-2023 school year. Documentation dated in the months preceding the school year, such as in the spring or the summer of 2022, is acceptable as long as the documentation shows evidence that the LEA was engaging in the process for the 2022-2023 school year. Questions related to this random validation for Title I Part A may be referred to Jaime Huerta or Vivian Smurl at essasupport@tea.texas.gov.